Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Vice Admiral Jake Jacoby, United States Navy, retired, and Chairman of AFCEA Intelligence Committee.
Everybody, welcome back. Welcome back for day two of the summit, and in keeping with yesterday's session with Mr. Bossert, the hectic schedules are in play, and the commitment by the members for the summit are notable. And Senator Warner and Representative Schiff both juggled their schedules this morning to make this happen. Unfortunately, their schedules didn't match up, so we're going to be speaking with each of them sequentially. Also, this afternoon, Director of National Intelligence Coates is required at a White House meeting, and he won't be available, but fortunately, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Sue Gordon, will speak to us instead, and it'll be one of Sue's first public appearances in her new role. Let me reiterate the importance of your questions, and in particular, early submission of the questions using the email questions at intelsummit.org for the first preliminary, and due to the short periods of time for each of the guests, get the questions in early, and nice, concise ones will be much appreciated. Also, let me reemphasize the continued opportunities to interact with the exhibitors and also our appreciation to the sponsors of this event. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Ms. Suzanne Kelly, who's the CEO and publisher of the Cipher brief, who will moderate the discussions with both Congressman Schiff and Senator Warner. Ms. Kelly.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. Thank you. Welcome to everyone this morning. I hope you're geared up for a great conversation.
I am, and I'm delighted to be in a situation where the House gets to go first. I want to compliment INSA for recognizing the proper order of things this morning.
Yes, well, I wonder what went on behind the scenes. We'll have to get down to the bottom of that. It's fantastic to have you here. You know, with so much going on in the intelligence community, so much of it showing up in sound bites on television on a daily basis, so much politics back and forth. When you take a deep breath and you sit back and you look at all the things we're dealing with, security clearance reform, an investigation into Russia, the 702 coming up for renewal later this year, how do you prioritize what you think is the most important?
Well, it is an enormous challenge this year in particular, because in addition to all of our day job responsibilities of oversight, we've also had the Russia investigation layered on top. And it's not as if the other issues went away or went on hiatus. When I think back, and I think all of us have felt a kind of a time-distorting effect of this year, where things that happened just yesterday seem like it must have been a week or a month ago. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, you know, I think we've done a very good job not only juggling these competing responsibilities, but also compartmentalizing our differences. And to give you a very graphic example, the chairman and I obviously have our differences over the Russia investigation, but we decided we were going to compartmentalize the oversight work the committee does and not let any differences we had on Russia interfere with what we had to do in terms of our oversight, with our authorization responsibilities. And so we produced, after our numerous hearings and review of documents and interviews and whatnot, a very bipartisan Intelligence Authorization Act that allocates the funding levels and provides the protections that we need in terms of people's privacy, and passed it overwhelmingly both in committee and on the House floor. That doesn't get the same attention as some of the twists and turns in the Russia investigation, but obviously is quite central to our responsibility. 702 will be another challenge. We've got a pretty good track record, though, when you look at how we accomplished the reform of the metadata program, how we passed information sharing legislation, the cyber information sharing legislation. So we have a history to build on, and I'm confident that we'll get through the 702 debate, I hope, in a thoughtful way.
So are you saying that it works much better than it appears to on network and cable news every day?
Well, it would have to, by definition, work much better than it appears, because it couldn't work much worse than it appears. No, I think a lot of the work that needs to get done, doesn't get the same attention, and is obviously of vital importance. I view our committee as having perhaps the most difficult oversight job in the Congress, because when you serve on one of the other committees and you're doing oversight, if you're on the Transportation Committee and the agencies come in and they're talking about high-speed rail and what a great project it is and how well it's going and how it's on budget and on time and all the rest of that, there are any number of outside stakeholders who can hold those witnesses accountable and can provide information to the committee and say, that's not true and this isn't right and you need to ask these questions. In our arena, where most of our hearings are in closed session, we don't have the outside stakeholders to the same degree able to give us input, insight, help us to ask the right questions or know when we're not getting a complete answer. So that's a very challenging oversight responsibility, but I think we're doing a pretty good job.
So that sounds like a very serious, maybe not flaw, but a default in the system that you have to overcome somehow, because you do have such incredible responsibilities with oversight of these programs that are constantly being judged by the American people when they hear snippets about what the program entails or what it doesn't. It's very difficult to know what to believe and to get the right information out there. How do you personally handle that when you don't have those outside people who you can go to kind of bring the level of expertise?
Well, one of the most important decisions we make is when we hire our staff. We bring people in often who have experience in the agencies, who do know a lot of the right questions to ask and have the background expertise to help us with our oversight. We also depend to a great deal, a great extent, on the professionalism of the people working within the IC, both on the government side and on the contractor side, to be candid with us, not just in answer to our questions, but also to bring us problems when they occur. And, I think that has by and large happened. So we benefit from the professional workforce that we deal with. At the same time, human nature is human nature. People don't necessarily like to volunteer their faults or problems. And people become vested in the way they've approached issues or programs. And so we need to continue to challenge the agencies to do better and continue to demand accountability in terms of what we're paying for certain programs, whether something that we've been doing the same way for a long time continues to be justified, whether we're getting the kind of results, whether we're setting the kind of metrics. So we have to be demanding, but I think that we benefit from a very capable staff and the professionalism within the IC.
You feel like you're getting the cooperation you need from the people you are overseeing?
Yes, there have been very, very few times where I've felt like we were getting misinformation. Mm-hmm. There's certainly times where I have disagreed with a briefer or their conclusion or their opinion or questioned the underlying facts that are being presented. But it's not a situation where I think people are deliberately trying to mislead us. Mm-hmm. There are times, I think, when we have a fresh perspective, not having become wedded to a certain approach. That can be very helpful and constructive, and I'm sure from the witness's point of view, they may view it differently and think that we don't have anywhere near the experience and time on task that they do, which is certainly correct. Mm-hmm. But it seems to work at the end of the day. And, obviously, in this kind of an era where we're dealing with new challenges in the form of terrorism and asymmetric warfare, but also now information wars with very capable adversaries and a burgeoning cyber field, we all need to work together to make sure that we have the capabilities we need to defend the country.
So what do you think the biggest challenges are right now? I mean, you wake up and read the same newspapers and websites and everything else that the rest of us do. When we see what's happening with North Korea, we're trying to prepare and make sure things are in place for another election, where you're dealing with federal level and state levels and possible attempts to try to manipulate messaging around those elections. How do you kind of prioritize these things?
It's very difficult because, our tendency, I think, like most institutions, is to focus on the most immediate problem,
right.
Which is not necessarily the biggest problem or the most long-term problem. or the problem that requires you to be able to allocate resources in a way that builds over time. I'm astounded, just with the crush of things going on, for example, that so little attention is being paid to the fact that Raqqa is going to fall soon. Soon, we hope. But we had the successful retaking of Mosul. Raqqa is going to fall. The last major urban holdings of the so-called caliphate are about to disappear, which is an important success on the battlefield. But it's gotten almost no attention just because of everything else going on. That doesn't mean by any means the war against ISIS is over or even nearing conclusion.
Or no longer a threat.
Or no longer a threat.
Right. We always worry about how is it going to impact us here at home. Right?
Yes.
We need to see that thread drawn, that connection made. Do you think that's happening enough in the news?
Well, on certain things, sure. I mean, on Korea, for example, people have a very vivid sense of the threat when they look at, okay, these missiles now can reach anywhere in the United States, and maybe they can carry a nuclear payload, and if they can't today, maybe they can tomorrow. In terms of the ISIS threat, okay, great news that the physical caliphate is disappearing, but what about the virtual caliphate that really, in many respects, holds much more danger to Americans in the sense of people being radicalized online and carrying out attacks in the name of ISIS.
Here in this country. Right?
Here in this country, exactly. But, I do think that in terms of at least the two threats that are most in the news these days, the threat from North Korea and the threat from Russia, people are quite vividly aware of the nature and dimension of those threats. How we're going to confront them, though, we still have a lot of work to do.
Let me just ask you, too, and then I'm going to get to some of the questions from audience members as well in just a moment here. We've already got some of them coming in here. Let's just talk really quickly about 702, because I think that's also another one that really has an incredible impact on the United States' ability to collect information and protect privacy of its citizens, right? Both are at stake with this. What happens the day after if it is not reauthorized?
I don't think first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. That is a failure to reauthorize 702. I think the only question is what form the reauthorization will take. I hope I'm not being overly optimistic about that, but I think it would be irresponsible for us. And yes, we've done a lot of irresponsible things in Congress, so that doesn't preclude that.
Shocking. Can I get you to say that just one more time?
We've actually probably done more irresponsible things by omission than by commission, but in any case, I think we will reauthorize. It's just a question of what kind of reforms we make to it. And here, it won't surprise people that the old adage of where you stand depends on where you sit has resonance in the sense that members of the Judiciary Committee, which have a very important oversight role, have one perspective. Members of the Intel Committee have a slightly different perspective. It's not that we don't appreciate the civil liberties and civil rights issues, we certainly do, or that the Judiciary Committee doesn't appreciate the Intel benefit and significance of what the program does. But in the committee, of course, we live day to day with the understanding of how important that is to our national security. And also, I think having a vivid understanding of how the program works is important and what the evidence has been in terms of have there been problems with the execution, have there been any intentional abuses of it, and also with respect to proposed reforms, what's the real downstream consequence of that? Does the criminal justice model of seeking a court approval, for example, to do a U.S. person search of the 702 database, is that really the right model? Does that work here? What happens if the U.S. person identity you're searching is a potential victim, not a perpetrator, or a place, not a person, or an address? So having an intimate understanding of the program helps in terms of what we think is a viable reform and what may not be.
And abuse of power is a big question, right? For people who don't understand exactly how the program works and they're hearing the headlines, the abuse of power, that's where the congressional oversight comes into play. Are you confident with the way the system is running right now with your ability to oversee when there are cases where someone is misusing certain access they may or may not have?
I do feel pretty confident about our ability to oversee this. I hope that's not wishful thinking, but I don't think it is. And it's not just because of the work we're doing or just because of the fact that the agencies do come in and self-report when they have problems, but also that we have the tremendous value added by the FISA court, by the fact that the FISA court itself does, I think, very rigorous review of these programs, and where they find problems, they they often will suspend an effort till they get the results they want, or they'll change what a program can do until they get the results they want. We will have access to those opinions and the concerns raised by the FISA court. So I think the combination of what the courts do in their oversight, what we do in our oversight, what the agencies do in their self-reporting is pretty comprehensive.
And working.
And working.
Great. Okay, let me keep going on my promise and get to some of these questions. A lot of what the audience is thinking about right now, oversight resources, 702 reauthorization, and the question about election security. Let's get to one of those questions. Do you believe the United States government is doing enough to prepare for another cyber attack against our elections? Given that elections are principally a state responsibility, what role should the intelligence community play? It's an interesting question.
I don't think we're doing enough, and coming from a state with such a powerful technology industry, when I meet with tech experts and talk about the machinery of the elections, they tell me, and I have every reason to believe that they are knowledgeable on this, that these systems are not impregnable. They are vulnerable, and I felt for quite some time, well before this past election, that any state or any voting jurisdiction that doesn't maintain a paper trail is negligent in this day and age. So, I think there's a lot more that we need to do. There's a lot more that we need to understand. I think the vendors of these voting machines need to be much more transparent with the government about their systems and their software so that we can analyze vulnerabilities. The states have to be willing to accept the government help that is being offered. And the government and the IC has to be more transparent with the states. The states still don't know if they were victims of Russian hacking. We have not shared that information with the states. I think that's crazy. And I know my colleague Mark Warner has been very outspoken on this, and properly so. I hope that we will have a hearing in our committee, an open hearing, where we can bring in some of the state elections people to talk about the vulnerability that they feel in terms of their infrastructure and the need for us to be more forthcoming with them. But we learn each and every day. Today there was a report by Symantec, or within the last 24 hours, about the vulnerability of our power grid, the fact that outside hackers have been able to get into the operational parts of those systems, not just probe some of the outlying parts of those systems. And we find that those systems are far more vulnerable than people may have expected.
And we've been talking about it for years, but we haven't really done a lot to protect the critical infrastructure.
Well,
a lot of studies, a lot of meetings, a lot of talking.
The big area that fell out of the cyber information sharing bill was the effort to deal with critical infrastructure. That was one area that there was simply too wide a gulf between the parties in terms of what's the federal government's role in protecting critical infrastructure. So, it is largely set by private industry. Now, there are obviously a lot of incentives for private industry to improve their security, but whether those incentives are sufficient or not is an open question. I will say that the fact that there's still vulnerabilities doesn't mean that nothing is being done. What it does mean in some cases is that this is a very asymmetric field where the advantages are all on the offensive, because those on offense only need to find one open door, and those on defense need to bar every window and lock every door. And that's inherently challenging, and it's a particularly inviting field for adversaries because there's always going to be plausible deniability. We've gotten very good at attribution, but our adversaries know that we're never going to make public the full capability we have to attribute. And so they'll always have some level of deniability.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd love to talk about so many issues. We've got some great questions here on Russian influence, but I know we're running out of time and that you have another appointment you need to get to this morning, but let me ask one more question following up on that answer about the cyber workforce. This is a great question from the audience. What is Congress doing to build the federal cyber workforce? How can the IC compete with these private companies to attract personnel with the right training? How can they pay them what they can make, and especially given the state you're coming from? Is a cyber reserve corps a real possibility in the near future, and might that bring any benefit?
Well, first of all, we can't compete financially with the Silicon Valley. I mean, some of the bright, capable people start in the Silicon Valley with salaries higher than yours or mine.
Yeah.
Certainly higher than mine, and
Yes.
a lot of people in the audience.
Probably mine too.
I'm sure that's true. So we're benefited by the fact that a lot of people choose to work in the IC because they feel a sense of patriotism and calling. And it draws them to that, and a lot of very patriotic people feel the same call to work within the private sector that are serving the IC. So that's tremendously beneficial. But we do need to continually work to recruit people. We need to continue working on diversifying the IC workforce. We also, I think, do need to explore creative ways to bring people in from industry for a period of years, then have them go back into industry.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, that there would be real benefit from that.
It would be, and they're great models for that. If you look at ARPA-E, for example, some brilliant people going into next generation energy technologies. They bring the knowledge they have from the private sector, they add value to the government, they go back to the private sector. There are obviously some difficulties and added complications in an IC environment, but nothing that can't be overcome, and I think we do need to look to these models as well as some of the interesting partnerships that already exist in terms of venture capital with the Silicon Valley.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I know we need a seamless congressional transition here this morning, so I'm going to thank you very much for taking the time to come here. I know you're very busy. Answer some of these questions. There are a lot more fantastic questions here, which I think we should have all forwarded to your office, and your very overqualified staffers would be happy to answer, because these are great questions. Thank you very much for submitting them. If we could also invite Senator Warner, I think he is here, or was supposed to be here about now. I'm trying to keep my eye on everything. We have a few more minutes? Oh, he's late. We get to talk. Okay, even better, because I do think we should talk a little bit about the Russia question. So let me pull up. What is this?
Wait, I think I see Senator Warner. I'm kidding.
I believed you. Okay, what is the scope and scale of Russian influence operations in the United States? It's just a small little question that we can, buy time with.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's really what we're aiming to find out. We're looking at each of the modalities the Russians have used elsewhere, some of which we, know with great certainty they employed here during the election, and others where we still need to find out were these tactics that the Russians used. I do want to make one point, because I know we have limited time, but getting to an earlier question of yours that's also implicated here, in the sense of what do we do about all this?
Yeah.
There is no software patch for what happened last year. There is no cyber defense capable enough. If the Russians want to get into the DNC in 2020, they'll get in. If they want to get into the RNC, they will get in. Really, the best protection that we can have is somehow forging the consensus we didn't have last year, that no matter who it may help or who it may hurt, if any foreign power intervenes in our affairs, let alone our elections, they will be repudiated. And anyone who tries to take advantage of it will be repudiated. More than anything else, I think that's what we need to defend ourselves, because what has been unleashed is not going to be put back in the bottle, and it's not going to be just an issue with Russia. It will be an issue with any country that wants to influence our affairs, and moreover, it'll be an issue for lots of other countries in their own relationship with each other.
You know what worries me, and I wonder if it worries you, when you look at influence operations, and you look at how we're getting news today, and you look at fake news and what's fake and what's not, you look at we're getting it through social media channels. Is there more of a responsibility that needs to be placed on the consumer of the news to question things that don't quite seem like they fit a pattern that, let's say they saw a story yesterday, when things are coming out of left field? Should we all be talking about putting more responsibility on the part of the person receiving news to say, wait a second, I'm going to throw up a BS flag?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this, I think, is a challenge for Americans. It's a challenge for people around the world. I've often found it bewildering that in Russia, for example, where during Soviet times people were so disbelieving of what they read in Pravda or Izvestia, and they recognized that it was merely the party line.
Propaganda.
People
right.
now are so believing of the Russian media. It's extraordinary, and I wonder what happened to the Russian skepticism of what their government has to say. But I think we all need to bring a certain inherent skepticism. I think we should also take a very serious look at what Facebook has just revealed publicly in terms of its own analysis.
Yes.
And one thing in particular, the Russians, and this is completely consistent with what the intelligence community found in its unclassified assessment, wanted, among other things, to sow discord in the United States. And look at what they were doing. Look at the issues they were choosing to grow the divisions in America. We ought to recognize that for what it is, which is this is a vulnerability that they see we have, these terrible divisions within our country. And if they feel that's a vulnerability, we need to recognize it as a vulnerability, and we need to do something about it. And this is why, I think it's so important from the very top on down that we make an effort to bridge these divisions, not aggravate them any further. And now I do see my Senate colleague.
Yes, I think he's here. And we'd like to thank you. I don't want you to rush off because I think we'd like to get a quick photograph. So if we could have everyone in the audience come on. No, I'm kidding. Congressman Schiff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Warner, welcome. Thank you for being
Senator, how are
here.
you? Good to see you.
And Chuck, did we need to get a quick photo?
So bear with us while we get a quick picture here and do a transition.
It's all the behind the scenes.
And to both of our guests here for juggling their schedules, for making this work,
Thank
a
you.
big thank you. Okay?
So, Senator,
Thank you very much. So when you pass each other in the halls, well, I guess you don't do that quite often, but when you do, what do you say to each other?
Before you arrived, we were talking about how INSA got the proper order of things and having the House go before the Senate. So just wanted to share that with you.
You're always the warm-up.
I'm going to step out of this.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Adam.
I'll invite you to have a seat right over here. Thank you very much,
Good job.
Congressman Schiff. It was very nice to see you this
Good to
morning.
see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Well, welcome. Hard to follow that, huh?
Wild
How's your morning?
days. How's my days? Well, in full disclosure, I was doing an interview and I jumped out of the car and grabbed a jacket. And unfortunately, I grabbed my aide's jacket, who's about 6 inches shorter than me. I'm not sure that's reflective of being a senator or vice chair of the Intel department, but it's either that or my August, I put on an awful lot more weight than I thought. But
You're going to get yourself in trouble.
I'm going to get myself in trouble on that. Yeah.
Well, welcome, and thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Suzanne.
taking the time. I know you're also on a very tight schedule this morning, so we appreciate you being here. And we have a very well-informed audience on all of the issues that you're tackling on a day-to-day basis. And we kind of ticked through a number of sort of high-priority things with Congressman Schiff. And I'd like to give you the same opportunity
Sure.
to do that as well. I know there are a number of issues, 702 being one of them we talked about a little bit this morning, security clearance reform being another. How big is the cyber threat? Just kind of walk me through when you wake up and you turn on the news or you read the paper, that moment of like, oh, wow, what next?
Well, let me step back and first of all, kind of, even before I wake up, a couple of general comments. One, this opportunity to be the vice chair of the Intel Committee is probably my greatest opportunity I've had in the Senate. It still remains as one of the committees that actually still functions on a bipartisan way, that gets bills out, that works through issues in ways that I think are appropriate. And I've been, generally very, very pleased with how our committee, for example, has taken on the whole Russia investigation. And I feel as a Virginia guy, it's kind of, I've got an extra both burden and responsibility since so many of our intelligence professionals either live in or retire to Virginia. So I'm
They
kind
know
of
where you live.
feel like I'm the local home guy.
Right.
And I think it's really important. It's one of the reasons why I was so frustrated both during the transition and you know, in the early days of the administration, I've got a lot of differences with the president, but where the president didn't seem to have that kind of respect for the intelligence community. I think that is, I think that's been troubling. I think it's challenged
Has it gotten
morale.
any better?
I think he is growing to understand that you cannot be the President of the United States without having a strong relationship with your intelligence community. And I think that's gotten better. But you know, for a community that doesn't get the thanks and the appreciation on a regular basis that it deserves, it's got to have respect if we're going to continue to attract world-class talent. And if the community is going to be able to continue to do its most important responsibility, which is speak truth to power and not be politicized.
So we've got Mike Pompeo in place now, who seems to be working very well with the president. We've got Dan Coates. We've got the appointment of Sue Gordon as Dan Coates'
Sue has
deputy,
been
which is
a long
phenomenal.
time friend. Yeah.
Yeah, so do you feel confident that things are working more now? Are we getting a little bit more away from the politics, focused on the substance and actually the issues that are going to impact all of us, regardless of political
Yes,
party?
I think there is progress. I give, you know, we've had with, you know, if you think about Robert Cardillo and Sue Gordon and Trish and obviously Admiral Rogers, you know, a lot of the community has stayed in place. Mike Pompeo has got a good background, come to the CIA. Dan Coates served with me for years, obviously a great appreciation of the IC. So I think we have made progress there. I think some of the areas that may not kind of rise to the level of the news on a regular basis, you know, there are things that are a little bit nitty-gritty that I'm still very interested in. For example, one of the things that Jim Clapper and I spent a long time with in his last year was, you know, can we make sure that the oversight program or the eyesight program, for example, the notion of a uniform IT backbone across the whole IC, kind of nerdy, but when you're talking about how we communicate and how we can make sure that there's better ability to move past silos, something very, very important. The question of clearances, you know, this has been a problem for ages. Our Intel bill that we passed out of the Senate committee, we start a reform process there, long overdue. The process, particularly if we're going to continue to attract world-class talent, and if we're going to think about not only bringing in people, you know, as they kind of come out of school, but as we think about mid-career transitions into the agency and into the Intel community, you can't have this 12, 18-month, 24-month security process, a security clearance process. So we've tried to say more uniformity across all of the agencies. You shouldn't have to duplicate that. And I think the main systemic change we're trying to push is, rather than having a, you know, arbitrary every 5-year re-review, this ought to be more risk-based. It ought to be more ongoing. There are clearly models actually from the private sector around security that we can, I think, implement on the IC side. One other area I want to kind of get out before we get to 702 and Russia and all the other things is, you know, an area that I kind of dived into for some time over the last couple years as a former guy from tech was the whole question of our overhead architecture. And, you know, I'm a big believer that we need to move from, you know, the world where we built on a 10-year cycle the world's most exquisite overhead architecture, and we had a procurement process that said we're going to take a year to two to get your requirements, and a 5 to 10-year period before we move from design to launch. That just doesn't make sense in a world where in overhead, you know, things are changing on a 2-year basis, and we're building sometimes, I think, multi-billion-dollar platforms in the sky that are exquisite. But I felt like, in a way, that for a long time, nobody in the IC community had ever seen a James Bond movie, because back to the early days of the James Bond movies, the bad guys always used laser beams to blow up satellites. Well, now we're seeing that, so I think we're seeing, and I compliment the NRO and others about moving from that kind of old-style architecture and procurement process to something much quicker, much more agile, much smaller, much more use of commercial. And again, these are areas that don't always necessarily make the headlines, but where a lot of our capacity and needs to kind of continue to move the community forward.
I love that. I feel like we're getting into some good substantive issues, and all of this kind of pulls together into what you need to do with providing good oversight and making sure that we're allocating resources we need to. Let me ask a question from the audience here. Global coverage. It says, with finite resources, the IC is focused on hard targets and terrorism. Countries like Guinea might not be important until there's a coup or a pandemic that affects U.S. interests. But at such a point, we need to understand dynamics in the affected region. Does the IC have an adequate understanding of so-called global coverage countries?
I think that is I think there is a growing recognition that problems can pop up anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think if we think about it, in the last 30 years, we've been counterterrorism, we've been Russia, we've been China, we've been North Korea, we've been Iran. But when we're thinking about environmental challenge, when we're thinking about pandemics, when we're thinking about the emergence of terrorism and revolutionary forces that are external just to their specific country, you got to have a broader footprint, and that means we need greater collaboration with our allies. We cannot do it all alone. It means greater usage of open source documents, and it also pushes us completely into the fact that a group of dedicated activists in some small country can actually challenge our nation, particularly within the cyber domain, because it's so asymmetrical. So I think thinking through this broader coverage rather than simply checking the boxes is an issue that both the community and we from the oversight capacity need to kind of think through.
Do you have time to think about what's coming next when you're living in a day-to-day environment where you have 20 things popping up on the radar, really 10 of which need immediate attention? Do you have time, the time that you need to plan for those things that are going to have a broader impact overall?
Well, it's not like the Congress is getting a lot done in other areas.
Can you say that again for me?
No, listen, I think that you got to carve out the time. And one of the things that Richard and I, on his chairmanship and my vice chairmanship, is we try to think through, all right, let's not just, I felt like the first few years when I was on the committee, being on the committee was a little like being in a kid's soccer game. The meetings were whatever was the hot spot that week, whatever the bad guys were doing that week in whatever specific location.
So you're reacting.
Yeah, and I think we need to be more proactive and forward-leaning.
Has it changed since, from your personal experience?
I think we're trying to move it in that direction, but as you mentioned, there's always something that requires immediate attention. We're going to get a classified brief on North Korea today. That is absolutely critical. But we have to also be able to sort through what are these emerging threats. I've been, for example, I've been saying since the beginning of the Russia investigation that I have real concerns about the way Americans, and for that matter, the world, takes in news. I think that, and I think Adam was probably, I didn't hear all his comments, but taking on this at the end. And it appeared to me that, the very social media sites that we rely on for virtually everything, our Facebook, Googles, and Twitters, it was my belief that the Russians were using those sites to intervene in our elections. And, the first reaction from Facebook, of course, was, oh, you're crazy, nothing's going on. Well, we find yesterday actually was something going on. And I think all we saw yesterday in terms of their brief was the tip of the iceberg. I want them back in. I want to see Twitter back in. I want to see others come back in. Not to be necessarily critical, because you've seen, for example, in the case of Facebook, they denied any, that they were being used in any way. Yet by the time, and didn't do anything, but by the time of the French elections, Facebook, working with the French, took down 50,000 accounts. Yeah. So, here is an emerging threat and challenge that we've got to see from the IC side, but we also, it breaks us into the whole legislative side. For example, even in the craziness after the, with unlimited campaign contributions flowing in to our campaigns, an American can still figure out what content is being used on TV advertising. You can look at it, you can go look at the ad, you may not be able to find completely the source, but in social media there's no such requirement. So, we may need legislative
So there may
solutions
be
that
a
come out of
reform.
it. There may be a reform
Right.
process here that I actually think the social media companies would not oppose, because I think Americans, when it particularly comes to elections, ought to be able to know if there is foreign-sponsored content coming into their electoral process.
Right.
And that's an area that's a brand new field. Does it just fall on the IC side? Not necessarily, but as we think about how we become more and more dependent upon our devices, that becomes a method of influence exponentially, I would argue, almost bigger than TV and radio.
And that's what we had talked just briefly about before. I kind of approach it with a soccer mom mentality of, okay, I understand what people in political parties are saying, and I understand that they're gaining momentum based on what their messaging is, and if they're delivering the message their audience wants to hear, there's probably you win Senate seats on catering to the people who support you. But is that necessarily the best thing for America? I think that's a great point that you brought up about being a little bit more critical of where you're getting information.
This is a brand new world. We are
Right.
communicating and we are receiving information in a different way. The IC's got to understand that, and we've got to sort through it.
Okay, let's get to a few of these other fantastic issues. Space. Do we have the policies, the organizations, the capabilities in place to optimize our utilization, I can say that, of the space domain? Are we able to effectively deny our adversaries use of that space domain? That's a great question.
I don't think we can deny our adversaries the use of space. What I worry about is, do we have the resilience, the flexibility, can we move away from the model of this exquisite government best technical means to a more distributed system? Because I would argue in many ways our enormous communications reliance on space, our enormous systems reliance, our enormous overhead capacity in terms of radar and electro-optical makes us in many ways more vulnerable. Because if I go back to my James Bond analogy, we thought we were going to control and dominate space forever. Now we're able to see nations, not just major nations, but potentially even smaller nations, have the capacity, to, if they can jam or interfere with those devices, that potentially even makes us more vulnerable. So how do we think lower? And then also, how do we think? Just again, I'm kind of obsessed on the overhead piece. We think about how we need, enormously greater coverage of North Korea. But as we think about it, even if we can get the space coverage, do we have the ground capacity to review all the data that comes in?
Another great
So this
one.
needs, again, a whole new
I know,
systemic approach.
Humongous problems. You mentioned innovation regarding satellites. Innovative technology companies have a hard time working through the federal procurement process, right? They may have the technology and they can't sell it. To what degree has the intelligence community incorporated cutting-edge technologies from startups and smaller tech companies, and have entities like InQtel, IARPA, and DIUX helped in this regard?
Well, we're making progress. And I do want to make the point again that while there's some great innovation going on in the Silicon Valley in overhead, there's also a lot of great innovation going on in the greater Washington area, particularly on the Virginia side. Here, so we need to look in both spaces, but we also have to, and I would say this is both on the DoD and the IC side, we've got to move our procurement process away from being so risk adverse. It's always easier to go with the big brand name. We've got to move on a more innovative side, and again, the chairman and I have, and he should really come around on this. I want to give Richard a lot of credit. You can't have a 2-year requirement cycle and then a 5 to 10 year procurement and launch cycle when you've got, my background, as many of you know, was in the cell phone business. Back in the mid-'80s, Wall Street and the telcos thought it would take 30 years to build out a single cell phone system, and at the end of that 30 years, 5% of Americans would have cell phones. They were wrong, and I got rich because I started Nextel and a series of other companies. I feel like we're in that same transition in satellites, and we have to move much faster, much more rapidly. We may not get it all right, and we've got to move to much, much smaller.
So how do we do that? What's your role in making that happen?
Well, we have been very specific with our colleagues in the IC that they've got to speed up the requirements in the procurement process. And I think I've seen a real positive movement forward.
You have?
Yes.
So you think we're headed in the right way?
I think we're headed in the right
At a fast
direction.
enough pace?
Well, if again we're just taking overhead, if you look at the transition on the commercial side and satellite just in the last 3 years, and from the cost of the bird to the launch costs, there it was 1/10 the cost. Now in many cases it's 1/50th the cost of what we're talking about.
We have a question here on POTUS information sources. Without getting too political, I'm going to throw this out there and see what happens. Most presidents have relied upon the intelligence community's objective, nonpartisan analysis for information about global developments. Do you think President Trump is drawing on the intelligence community's insights to inform policy decisions? And I'm going to just add on a last question to that. Do you think that's changed from a president who was just coming into office, who had no experience working with an intelligence community, to one who has now been in office, has people in place of the leaderships of these intelligence communities? Have you seen a change and a shift in his reliance on and confidence in the IC's assessments? A face is worth 1,000 words.
The combined knowledge, experience, an analysis of the IC versus Breitbart? I sure as hell hope so. But listen, that is a continuing worry, I think, of,
Do you think it's
I think
getting
that is
any
a
better?
continuing worry
Do you
of
think
members
as
of
he
both
learns
parties.
sort of the job?
Listen, it's critical, I want the president to succeed. For his sake, but most importantly for our country's sake.
Yeah.
And he has to learn that. But it has been a slower process than I'd hoped. How's that for a PC answer?
I just want everyone to get along. I just want to take the focus onto these issues that are actually going to impact all of us. But I agree, it's frustrating from the person outside of Washington to look at what's going on and think, are we doing the best we can?
But that is where, again, I think the IC's role really goes up exponentially and more important. I mean, the notion, just not just that a president, but for an average American consumer of information, the amount of information sources that overwhelm you.
Yeah.
And this goes where when the normal question we get is what keeps you up the most at night in terms of these traditional threats.
Right.
I wouldn't put those 5. I would put the asymmetrical threat around cyber really bothers me more. It bothers me in terms of the fact, and I think Adam raised this as well, it drives me crazy that we've had 21 states that were broken into and we still have almost a Kafka-esque response that we can't share with the top election official because they don't have appropriate clearances.
Right.
We've got to be better prepared. I know I'm going in just 1 minute. We've got to, if you look at the fact that we've got 10 billion devices that are connected, IoT devices to the internet at this point, we're going to go to 25 billion. We don't have any security built into most of those devices. Each of those can be, if not weaponized, taken over. When we think about the whole notion that of our technological advance also makes us more technologically vulnerable. So
Right.
sorting through how we get our information, and not in a way that interferes with First Amendment rights, but Americans deserve to have the knowledge of what is at least the source of the information so they can make a judgment. And I think we all have to use our tools more. And that, again, means for the IC, both to the president and to the Congress, boy, oh boy, their responsibility to kind of analyze, sort, and get this information to policymakers is more important than ever.
It's critical. So I know that you have to go as well, and so we're going to wrap up, but I want to ask you one more question. When you look at the role of Congress and all of these issues that we've talked about this morning, and their responsibilities, give me an honest answer of what can Congress do better? What can just, when you're looking in your own backyard, what can Congress do better?
Well, I would argue, beyond just the IC,
beyond the IC.
Yeah, what I would say is, I was at a dinner last night for John Warner, and it was a series of, folks talking about the good old days of Congress when people would get together. I think I would argue there are two things we can do. I think that committees and committee chairs need to take some of the power back and not have Congress continually driven simply by the Democratic or Republican leadership, number one. And number two, I think in this day and age, we need to realize that most of the issues from our kind of economic challenges, I would argue as somebody who was blessed to do well in business, the fundamental challenge that we have from an economic standpoint is how do you actually make modern capitalism work for enough people again? And we have to understand that most of the issues we are arguing about are frankly 20th century issues. We're relitigating liberal versus conservative, left versus right, when more of the issues are future versus past. And if we can reset that framework on that future versus past, I think there may be a whole way for a new set of alignments. The vast majority, I can't speak for the House, but the vast majority of members of the Senate get along, at least privately agree on 80% of the issues, and we ought to produce a lot better product for the American people than we're producing at this point.
That's a great thought to end on. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your
Thanks,
time
everybody.
this morning.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for the excellent questions as well. It's very nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, in the interest of keeping the trains running on time, we're going to do a 30-minute networking break, and then we have 3 breakout sessions as shown in your program, and they begin at 9:45. We'll see you back here at 11:05 for the International Combating Terrorism panel. Just to be forewarned, the break between the end of the breakout sessions and 11:05 is short, so you might want to plan your restroom timing accordingly. We'll see you back here at 11:05.
Thank you.